All right, so jumping right in, for people who may not know, what is red tide?
Yeah, so red tide is many things actually, but when we specifically talk about red tide, and you'll notice anytime we write about it in the Tampa Bay Times, we capitalize the R, we capitalize the T. We're talking about one thing in particular. Red tides, the umbrella term, can mean a lot of different types of algal blooms, but what we're talking about is a specific microorganism. It's called Karenia brevis. And what that organism does is it produces neurotoxins. They're called brevetoxins. And so when we're talking about red tide here, we're talking about blooms of Karenia brevis. And specifically, that means when that organism is around at a greater than normal concentration. It's sort of always in the water here in the Gulf of Mexico, but usually it's at such a low level, or what scientists will call a background level, that it's not even something that rises to the level of something people would notice or that would cause issues. But when it blooms, when it proliferates and becomes present in really high concentrations, then you get a situation like what we're dealing with now.
Gotcha. So what causes a bloom then?
Yeah, what causes a bloom is a good question, and it's something that scientists are still very much trying to figure out. The sort of story of Karenia brevis is not entirely told or well understood at this point. And so that's kind of a matter of active research, like what causes a bloom to take off or what causes Karenia to show up in a certain place. But there are some basic things that we do know. And that is that the algae require nutrients to grow, right? It's just like a plant on land. It needs nutrients to grow in a lot of cases. Can also be photosynthetic with sunlight. And so blooms happen when conditions are right for Karenia brevis to thrive, for the organism to thrive. And so that might mean access to something that can help it gain energy and sustain itself. That can also have parameters like certain water temperatures might be more favorable than others. Certain levels of salinity, the saltiness of the water might be more favorable than others. And so basically what causes a bloom is it's around and there's enough stuff around that it can thrive upon for it to really start to get at higher and higher levels.
Gotcha. So are blooms seasonal, and what are some of the factors that can make them more severe? Like what kind of nutrients?
Sure. So ask the question about whether or not blooms are seasonal. Kind of. They can happen at different seasons, and they can linger through multiple seasons. But when we typically are talking about red tide on our coast here off of Tampa Bay and further into Southwest Florida, it's most often happening in the fall. But obviously right now we're seeing a summertime bloom, so that's a little bit different. And when we're talking about nutrients, one sort of big one that you'll read in a lot of our coverage right now, and that is essential, is nitrogen, and nitrogen in the water. And Karenia can take advantage of multiple different forms of nitrogen, and it comes into the water from many different sources. Tampa Bay is what is known as an estuary, and that's where freshwater and saltwater meet. So you have freshwater flowing from rivers, salt water coming in from the bay, tidally influenced, and that creates, to really sort of shorten it, very rich ecosystem and habitat. And part of that ecosystem and habitat is that there are nutrients in the water. But we also have man-made pollution that puts excessive amounts of nitrogen in the water in some cases, and that can be runoff from land. You'll have a big rainstorm, washes through everybody's yards, and if they used fertilizer, which often has nitrogen in it, that will carry nitrogen into the water. Sometimes sewage overflows or spills or poorly treated sewage that reaches the water is carrying more nitrogen. Or, as I think we're definitely going to get into here, you can have an episode that leads to a sudden sort of dumping. And this year we had one of those in Tampa Bay, where we dumped more than 200 million gallons of nitrogen-rich wastewater from an old fertilizer plant property into the bay.
Right. And, since we're on the topic, why don't we just go ahead and address what you're talking about, which is the Piney Point disaster. And, for people who maybe don't know, could you give a little recap about what happened and how it could possibly be contributing to red tide?
Yeah, absolutely. So uh, where do we begin? The story of Piney Point, decades old, but Piney Point is a old fertilizer plant property that sits just off of Tampa Bay at Port Manatee. It's in Manatee County. It's just below the Hillsborough County line for our local audience. It's 20 or 30 minutes south of downtown Tampa at most, depending on traffic. And for years, Piney Point was a place where fertilizer manufacturing companies took a rock carved out of Florida's land, phosphate, and broke it down to create a product that's key to making fertilizer. And that process produces a lot of waste that's heavily regulated and heavily monitored. It's particularly something called phosphogypsum, which is held in stacks, and something called processed water, which is polluted wastewater from that process of fertilizer production. And what happened with Piney Point is a couple of decades ago, its owner abandoned the site. And so whereas when an active fertilizer plant is running, you might be cycling that water through constantly, it just sat there and became a real boondoggle for the state in terms of how they were going to deal with all of these polluted byproducts of the industry. And years happened, multiple spills or controlled releases of Piney Point waste into the environment, which led to algal blooms in the past. And eventually we reached a point where Piney Point became a disposal site for materials from a dredging project at the port. There was another issue then, and Piney Point has continued to be this sort of problem site that's loomed as a threat to Tampa Bay, where there has been waste that basically there's no end date on getting rid of it or no easy solution to getting rid of it. And it's just lingered there. And to some extent, it's been allowed to linger there. And you can look back through some of our past coverage to see times when the state had a chance to push Piney Point to closure but didn't. And so what happened this year is that one of these massive reservoirs that exists on the old Piney Point site, where there's no longer a plant where we're no longer producing fertilizer, had a leak. And that leak triggered some fears that the entire reservoir, which had hundreds of millions of gallons of water, could suddenly release into surrounding neighborhoods. It would have been like a storm surge. And so the state, citing those concerns of a total collapse, allowed Piney Point's private owners, which is a company called HRK Holdings, to discharge water from that reservoir into Tampa Bay at Port Manatee. And the idea was that it would release pressure and hopefully avoid a total collapse of the stack. But what that meant is that you had wastewater that was rich in nitrogen getting put into Tampa Bay in a really large quantity. And so, like I said, that's more than 200 gallons. It was about 215 million gallons, according to what the state has told us. And it was really high in nitrogen. And so when you talk to folks who are both clean water advocates and the people who are tasked with managing Tampa Bay, they basically say that what happened was a year's worth of nitrogen for that section of the bay. It's called Lower Tampa Bay, the sort of lower third there of Tampa Bay, was put into the water in the span of about 10 days. So you had a sudden rush of that nutrient hitting the water off of Piney Point. And that happened between late March, like the very end of March, and the first or second week of April.
Gotcha. I do just want to note that I am seeing your questions, guys, and we will hopefully get to some of them. But as Zach said, we do have a lot of coverage on Piney Point and Red Tide on our website. So if you're only here for a short time and you want to read more, I have pinned the link to our Red Tide page in the comments below. You can also just go to tampabay.com/redtide and you'll find all of our coverage there. If you're just joining us, I'm here with environment reporter Zach Sampson, talking about the red tide crisis here in Tampa Bay. And we just discussed a little bit of how the Piney Point disaster may be kind of intertwined or involved in the red tide crisis going on right now. So thank you for that, Zach. Moving on to kind of another topic that I know concerns a lot of people here is the harm that it's doing to the fish and the sea life here in Tampa Bay. Can you tell us about that and how it could be really endangering the future of Tampa Bay's health?
Sure. So as I said, the organism that creates a red tide bloom it produces toxins. And for people, you might know that because you go to the beach and you feel respiratory issues, right? You know that there's something off. But it can be deadly for fish, and particularly fish kind of up the food chain. And so when a red tide is around, you might start with a fish kill and you see some bait fish, small fish, grunt, pinfish, which is what it started with here. And then it continues to move up the food chain, right? Because bigger fish are eating the smaller fish, which now carry all these toxins. The red tide's moving around. It may get a little bit worse in terms of conditions. And so what you end up having is toxins just entering the system for fish and other sea life as well. Turtles can be affected. Manatees can be affected. Dolphins can be affected. Crabs can be affected. Not always necessarily negatively, but you do have it moving through the food chain. And to take an example of fish, what tends to happen, according to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, is basically their gills stop working. And so you get these massive fish kills, and you have floating dead fish that are washing ashore, blown by winds. That kind of dictates where the fish go. And the harm to the ecosystem can kind of be spread even throughout. There are times where toxins can settle in seagrasses. Manatees could continue to eat those and ingest toxins for a month or two after the bloom is at its peak. Red tide can shade out the water, which seagrasses need sunlight to grow. And it can lead to the death of seagrasses, which then sends a cascading effect because those are nurseries for fish. Those are food sources for sea turtles and manatees. So what we've seen right now is fish up and down the scale dying, everything from mullet up to Goliath grouper. There have been manatees that have been suspected to have died, dolphins, turtles, and that's kind of been that's been sort of the most visible effect so far.
You cut out
of red tide. Oh, I cut out. Where
okay,
did I
you cut out for a second. I'm not quite sure, but that's okay because we're probably going to say it again anyways, because
Okay.
I was going to ask, and you're just asked, how much worse fish kills have been this year compared to last year or the year before and years in past. So maybe if you answer that, it can help us fill the hole.
Yeah, sure. No problem. So the last time we got a bad red tide bloom was 2018. And this fish kill has proceeded in a slightly different way, according to the people who have responded to both of them. So whereas that last fish kill kind of moved up the chain from bait fish, inshore species, to reef fish like the Goliath grouper, this sort of had all of them happening at once. Pinellas County is kind of our best example in the epicenter for both of those fish kills. So in 2018, Pinellas County collected just over 1,800, almost 1,900 tons of dead sea life and debris. So it's both dead fish, other sea animals, and then seagrasses and just muck. This year, as of like our last count, Pinellas is just below that. They're in the 1,600s of tons of dead sea life and debris. So that's kind of one way to measure the fish kill, the type of species that are dying and how much has been collected. But in some ways, this has been more difficult than that because so many of the dead fish died within Tampa Bay. And that led a lot of them to get into finger canals and into onshore areas where it was harder to pick up and also was right off of people's docks and back porches versus coming just ashore on the beaches.
Gotcha. And I'm seeing a lot of comments about, how can we help? How does this, get resolved? And we are going to get to that, guys, but I did want to address some questions from earlier about, we know it's bad for marine life, but how bad is it for humans? So let's cover that first.
Sure. So definitely check the Times today. My colleague Rose Wong has a story specifically about the potential human health effects. And again, might not be the most satisfying answer, but something that's an active subject of study with red tide. We're learning about it sort of all the time. The thing you hear about most is potential respiratory issues at the beaches. And so what that entails would be you go there and you feel kind of like you have a cold. Certain people are more sensitive to it than others. People who have chronic respiratory problems like asthma might feel it even more severely than minor symptoms, but it's like a scratchy throat, kind of an itchy nose, your eyes might be watery, and you might start to have a cough, this red tide cough. That's kind of the standard. But again, it it contains toxins and it's killing fish. And so, you know, you shouldn't be swimming around dead fish because it's not just red tide, but there's decaying fish there, and you know, who knows what you could be exposed to in that front. And red tide can cause you know, some skin trouble for some people. If you've got an open cut and you're swimming around you know, the algae, it can cause problems. There have been studies into potential neurological effects. It definitely can have an impact on people, and because of that, there are a lot of health. There's like a health advisory still in effect for Pinellas, and there are things that you can do to try to keep yourself from getting exposed to a lot of red tide.
Gotcha. So we just wanted to quickly cover that, but if you want to read more about that, as Zach mentioned, we just published a story from our reporter Rose Wong on the effect of the red tide on humans in Pinellas County and around the Bay Area. So if you want to read that, you can actually find it at tbtim.es, which is part of the link I've pinned below, /red tide human. That'll take you directly to the article. Or you can just go to what I pinned earlier, which is the red tide page, and you'll find it there as well. So we have some questions about, you know, how does this bloom end? What is the timeline? What can we do to help? Let's go there.
Cool. How does this bloom end? I don't know. And nor do scientists. I'm not a PhD, but I feel confident because all of the people who do have PhDs and study this that I talk about say that we don't really know what's going to end a red tide. I know that's probably not the answer people want. That doesn't mean it's going to last forever. It means it's hard to predict. And when we talk about what's going to end a red tide, I think that naturally kind of brings up the idea of, is there something we can do to like nuke it, you know? Which sounds ridiculous, but if you go back like decades and decades, like when Florida had red tide in the mid 20th century, that was an idea. People were like, can we just bomb it? And we can't. And researchers are trying to study ways to neutralize red tide, but we don't have a good solution yet. And so that doesn't mean it's going to be here till December. It could, but we just kind of have to wait and see. And one thing that kind of begs the question of is, how long will we be feeling this effect? How long will fish be washing up dead? How long will we have respiratory issues? And a lot of that, now that red tide is primarily in the Gulf instead of Tampa Bay, is going to be dictated by winds. Winds can push this bloom around. The bloom is patchy. It's not one continuous block, so it could move. It could come back. If the winds are blowing onshore, you're going to feel respiratory effects, and you might have dead fish washing ashore. If the bloom is blowing offshore, you might be able to be at the beach, and there could be a red tide a mile or two off, but you won't necessarily feel that kind of cold symptom or see a lot of dead fish. So it's just going to vary a lot. And I'm sure everybody on here is familiar with a weather forecast. It's kind of what we're talking about. You know, it's hard to predict what the winds are going to be more than a week out. And so that means in this situation, it's hard to predict how severe our red tide symptoms are going to be more than a week out, which is a plug to keep paying attention, and we'll keep covering it.
Of course, yes. And, you know, going off of that, like, I know that Pinellas County has been working hard to clean up the dead fish. How does that help in terms of, you know, mitigating red tide and saving some other sea life?
Yeah, so when we talk about red tide continuing to bloom, it's because it needs fuel. And the fuel comes in the form of nutrients like nitrogen, as we were talking about before. And the thought is, what researchers believe is that all of those dead fish are going to recycle nutrients back out into the ecosystem. And so they'll continue to release nitrogen as they decay, which the red tide can use to further fuel itself. It becomes, you know, another way in which it has access to sustenance, basically. And so removing those fish from the water can help prevent that surplus of nutrients from continuing to give the red tide more and more fuel.
Okay. And, you know, going off of that, I know part of this whole situation has been some tension between the government in Pinellas County and the St. Petersburg mayor, as well as, you know, the state government and Governor DeSantis in terms of, you know, whose responsibility is the funding. Can you tell us a little bit about that drama?
Yeah, sure. So there's been frustration from local environmental groups and like advocacy groups, and also some city staff, where the city has wanted a declaration of a state of emergency. Governor DeSantis's office has said that's not necessary. In 2018, the last bad red tide bloom, there was a declaration of a state of emergency. And what the governor's office now says is that was necessary then to open up a source of funding to help pay for things like picking up the dead fish, because a dedicated pot of money didn't exist at that time. But since the governor has taken office, he says that he has funded not only red tide research, but also created this pot of money that the Department of Environmental Protection, Florida's lead environmental agency, can tap into to help pay for fish kill cleanups. And so far the state has offered, more than $1 million to help the city in Pinellas pay for those fish kill cleanups. The local folks who have wanted a state of emergency say that it's not just about money that they needed during the peak of the bloom. They needed staffing. They needed help drawing down like more boats to get out there and get on the water picking up these dead fish. And so I think it was this question of, is money coming? Yes, money's coming. What else do we need? And that was kind of led to a back and forth that I would say has maybe died down a little bit in terms of how much we hear about it or how many public comments are made, but was certainly a way in which the conversation around red tide became political. And there was a definite local and state back and forth on that level that we saw play out.
Right. And have there been any other critiques in terms of the government response? Have been people, been upset in other ways?
Sure. I would say the number one way in which people are upset is with Piney Point. So Piney Point has gotten a lot of attention with this red tide, understandably so, because what we do know is that you'll hear a lot the government say or scientists say or officials say, Piney Point did not cause this red tide. And what they mean by that is that red tide didn't show up in Tampa Bay because of Piney Point necessarily. But what we do know and what scientists do say is that we put a lot of nitrogen into Tampa Bay with Piney Point, and that could be exacerbating the bloom. It could be giving that bloom further fuel to continue to take off. And because of what we talked about earlier with this idea that there were opportunities to kind of shut down Piney Point or reduce the risk that site posed to the environment here over the years that were not taken advantage of under the state's watch, people are ticked off and say, look, we're getting another algal bloom. This isn't the first problem we've had that has come around that site or potentially had connections to that site. And so you have a lot of frustration of why wasn't something done before.
Right. And we're getting some questions kind of following up on Piney Point about, is it going to be cleaned up and closed completely? Is the spill still going on? What's being done about the phosphate mining?
Sure. So a couple of things on that. So one, Piney Point is not, and this is sometimes it's a small distinction maybe to most people, but it was never a phosphate mine. It was never the place where the rock was pulled from the earth, but it was a place where it was a plant where it was broken down, a fertilizer plant where it was processed. And so what we're left with there is the waste material from that processing. That's phosphogypsum and to some extent the water that was used in that process. And people who live across Central Florida might be familiar with gypsum stacks. They can be hundreds of feet high. They cover hundreds of acres. It's a super flat state, and they're like the only thing that rises above the flatness in some places. So you've got a lot of phosphogypsum still at Piney Point, and you've also got this wastewater. And so what the state is trying to do, or says that it's promising to do, is to get rid of all that water that's at Piney Point, which is what's caused problems in the past with spills. So what's being done about it? The Department of Environmental Protection is still providing oversight. There has been a lot of conversation around potentially more than 100, maybe up to $200 million in state funding coming to dispose of that water at Piney Point. And one of the leading contenders for how to do that right now is the idea of treating it and pumping it down in a deep injection well at that site underground. That's sort of the thing you're hearing most talked about. Not everybody likes that idea. They worry about potential impacts to the ground, to the Floridan aquifer. But that's sort of where things stand with Piney Point. In terms of a timeline of how quickly that could happen, I don't have a good estimate for that, how long we could be talking about Piney Point before it's fully closed.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering those questions, and thank you guys for sending in your questions. We love to be here and interact with you. So I just want to thank everyone for joining in and watching and interacting. Before we wrap up, I do want to have you give some resources for people who want to help. Can you volunteer to pick up fish? What can we do?
Sure. In terms of volunteering to pick up fish, there hasn't been like that I've seen a massive drive or a huge effort to get a ton of volunteers to do that. It's been city crews, county contractors. We're getting paid to do it. But especially in St. Petersburg, like the city said when red tide was bad in the bay, and it's eased up there in terms of the fish kills, when that stuff was washing ashore in private property, they weren't going to go on private property to pick it up. So you did see residents having to take care of sort of their own backyards. In terms of ways to help, right? I think it's not always satisfying to people to, like, when you have a major spill like something from Piney Point, to then focus on smaller pollution that maybe we all have a hand in. But it is something that the scientists who study red tide and the county officials who work on water quality have been speaking about quite a bit during this bloom. While people are paying attention to it, there are forms of pollution that we contribute to that we can cut down on. You could use less nitrogen-rich fertilizers, especially during the rainy season. You can pick up your dog's waste, because if you don't, it's going to get washed out to the bay at some point. It's kind of the all drains lead to the ocean idea here. You can continue to lobby your local representatives to keep water quality as a focus. And those are all sort of small things that you can do to keep the attention on this, and to sort of try to take a situation that has a lot of eyes, and that is a tragedy for Tampa Bay and an environmental crisis for Tampa Bay, and learn from it, and maybe improve that kind of collective public resource going forward.